This is Iran in the 70s. They dance the twist, listen their rock and roll and wear miniskirts. And this is not just a woman with a cigarette, but the second wife of the local Shah. And that smiling man with the lighter, that's the Shah himself. But in modern Iran, the country's leader looks different. Women wear not bright miniskirts, but Muslim classics. And now they are not practicing Western dances or singing, but sometimes like this, even in shooting. How a country that was on the path of Westernization and Americanization eventually turned into a harsh Islamic republic. From what suddenly from an ally of all the USA, England, the USSR, Iran becomes a pariah state. And most importantly, why are the anti-government protests in the Iran again today? And what could they lead to? First, let's compare these two amazing figures. Almost 99%. So what is it? Look, in 1963, Iranian authorities held a referendum and asked their people a simple question. Do you support our very cool reform? We're going to fight illiteracy and provide free primary education for everyone. Peasants will be able to buy land from landlords and will deal with federal pass that prevents Iran from developing. We'll give women a bunch of different rights, including voting rights. And of course, we'll develop modern industries. Yes, and most importantly, we'll head towards a bright Western future with our allies from the USSR and Great Britain. And what do Iranians say? 99.9% confidently say, yes, we want it. And now, let's fast forward 16 years. Iranian cities look like this. Crowds of protesters are smashing government buildings, burning portraits of the Shah and wishing him death, and literally praying for their spiritual Islamic leader, who was expelled from the country 14 years ago, but support the revolution. And in the end, the Islamic revolution wins. The Shah flees, and in 1979, in another referendum, different questions are asked. Do you want a real, honest Islamic republic instead of all this pro-American madness with women in miniskirts? Well, you get it. 99.3% of voters say exactly the same thing. Yes. And on the one hand, it seems that for 16 years, Iranian society has been on a tough pro-Western path, and it appears to be disappointed and wants something of its own, something traditional Iranian. Logical, but not quite. So, Iran's population in 63rd was approximately 23 million people, and only 5.5 million, less than a quarter of all Iranians, voted for pro-Western reforms. But the authorities claim that 99% of us support them, convincing. And then, in 79, Iran's population had already reached 37 million, and more than half of the country's inhabitants, 20 million people, voted for the Islamic Republic. But the authorities again use a more convincing 99% without change. So, do you feel it? In fact, both groups want to rely only on their fierce audience and don't care about the interests of the rest. But how come Iran was first embraced by the collective West and then became an outcast under sanctions? Iran, or formerly Persia, is a state that until 1979, for over 2,500 years, was a constant monarchy. So it's obvious that any traditions there will be stronger than any innovations. The last Shah came to power in 1941, exactly at the moment when Iran was occupied by Soviet and British troops. Why are they doing this? First, as a wartime ally, and then there is the war against Germany, strategic oil reserves are needed, and Iran has plenty of it. Just so you understand, today there is 2.5 times more oil there than in Russia or the Arab Emirates, 4 times more than in the USA. So in general, Iran ranks third in the world in principle, after only Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. The second reason is the country's very advantageous geographical position. During the Second World War, the Soviet Union, through this Iranian railway, would receive a third of all its lend-lease, that is, military and humanitarian aid from the USA. And you probably heard that it was in Tehran in 1943 that the historic meeting of the anti-Hitler allies Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt took place. But truth be told, they don't like to remember this meeting in Tehran itself. Why? Well, because I remind you, the country was occupied by these allies. When the Second World War ends, both British and Soviet troops will of course withdraw, but no one will leave their appetite for Iranian oil behind. So, an interesting example. As soon as one local prime minister plans to nationalize, that is, return to Iran what initially belongs to Iran, the largest local oil company, what will the Americans and the British do together? Right. They send their agents of influence, and the government of the disobedient prime minister is overthrown, and the oil company will ultimately be divided among BP, Shah, the big five American companies. Well, they'll give a little to the French. And what will Iran get? A contract for 25 years and 50% of the net profit. Someone will say, well, isn't it great? And I'll answer that the oil is Iranian, but arrogant guys come to extract it on their own terms from somewhere. Oh yes, so that no more local prime ministers with creative ideas try to take what belongs to Iran, they don't appear. The British and Americans are betting on the Shah. After all, he doesn't particularly show off during the occupation. Well, let him rule. And if he bothers, then the local Iranian parliament let him dissolve it. The main thing is that profitable conditions work. For the West, oil. For Iran, money. And a little technology. And for the Shah, palaces. After all, he's the Shah. And on one hand, what's wrong with that? With the oil money, the Shah begins to reform Iran honestly. Just look at Tehran in the 70s. They even called it the Paris of the East back then. How many streets have modern foreign cars? How stylish and attractive the shop windows are. People in bright clothes, fashionable magazines with Iranian beauties on the covers. Women teach in schools and make laws in local parliaments. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians study in Western universities. In short, how Iran flourished under the Shah. But in reality, not everyone benefits from these capital transformations. Look, Iran in the mid-20th century was a purely agrarian country with a mediocre and below-average level of technological development. The Shah, as I said, understood this and began reforms. On one hand, new equipment appeared in villages, labor productivity increased, but on the other hand, so many peasants and laborers were simply no longer needed in rural areas. When there are tractors, the same combines, and what happens is that millions of poor Iranians move to cities in search of a better life. But there you won't find any kind of Stalinist industrialization or a Chinese production leap. Of course, factories are being built, for example, enterprises with French automakers Peugeot, Renault, Citroën, but there is no massive acceleration like in the Soviet Union or later in China. As a result, Tehran itself begins to be surrounded by slums. For most newcomers, there is no job, no decent housing, no money, no entertainment. But radical ideas of various preachers work perfectly on them. The poor start protesting and demand to overthrow the reformist Shah, with all this Western way of life that they see but don't obtain. And what does the Shah respond to this? Well, in 71st, he decided to celebrate the 2005th 500 University of the Persian Empire in grand style. So he decides to party right in the desert. For the 3-day bash, they'll build a real city with tents, bring in 15,000 trees to the desert, and 50,000 songbirds. For wine and champagne in the heat, helicopters will haul blocks of ice the size of a van. Probably the heads of 65 states will show up for the bash and be pleased. But the Iranian people themselves are not exactly thrilled. In one interview, the Shah is asked, "Isn't such a party ridiculously expensive? And couldn't the money have been spent on those very social needs?" But the Shah calmly replies, "How would they know how much it costs?" American journalists later estimated the celebration at $100 million. Today it would be over $600 million. It's not the scale that's irritating, but the fact that the celebration isn't for Iranians. It's a show for foreigners. The problem with the Shah isn't that he chooses some incorrect Western development, but that his regime poorly managed the country, steals and ignores real problems and figures. And when the economy was growing, people were more or less satisfied. But when, by the end of the 70s, growth finally stops, pro-Islamic guys just skillfully play on the moods of dissatisfied but poorly educated masses and sell them the idea of a traditional Islamic state where everyone will be fine. But it from that moment on that, Iran gets worse every day, and those same sanctions begin to be imposed against it. And so until February 22, 2022, Iran was a leader in the number of sanctions. So it was. There were all the perks of isolation. Instead of international payment systems, there were their own. Instead of our familiar internet, there are analogs of YouTube, Facebook, and Netflix. All foreign cars are priced at X2, so the majority drive Iranian budget cars and on very cheap but terribly low-quality gasoline. So it's understandable that there is plenty of oil in Iran, but all advanced technologies are blocked. As a result, Tehran is constantly in smoke. The main economic result of Iran's transition from the Western model to its own Islamic one can be described in simple numbers. In 78-79, Iran produced 6 million barrels of oil per day. In 2015, less than 3 million. And today, Iran at best produces and sells 2 million. And oil revenues are the main source filling the country's budget. And think about it, the need for oil in the late 70s and today it's just two different worlds. Can you imagine how much money the country could earn and spend on its own development if it hadn't started making hysterical, ill-considered decisions? And it has come to the point that today Iran has no money for its own rapid development. Out of 85 million inhabitants, 42 million are on social benefits. And yet a third live below the poverty line. In Iran, they would like sanctions to ease, but neither America nor the European Union wants this anymore, probably until the regime changes. Iran is clearly awaiting change. Firstly, remember I mentioned its excellent geographical position. Well, indeed, Persia has always been a crossroads of trade routes. It has access to the Caspian Sea, through the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean. And secondly, the country is full of resources. These are waste hydrocarbon reserves, plus a large percentage of educated people. For you to understand, according to statistics, every year 150,000–180,000 qualified specialists immigrate from the country. But why does this happen? Because thinking people need not only money. The question is, what opportunities does the country offer as a whole? The opportunity to be killed if you wear the hijab incorrectly. The Iranian morality police beat and killed 22-year-old Iranian Mahsa Amini because she didn't wear the hijab properly. In response, women across Iran demonstratively start cutting their hair and removing their hijabs, while men take to the streets in protest demanding a change in leadership because they understand that any one of them could be next. But no authority is rushing to change itself, because they are accustomed to suppressing protests according to a tried and tested scheme. For example, the government recently tripled gasoline prices. This was just recently. And people take to the streets. What's their response? Standard. The government blames all foreign enemies and shuts down the internet for several days or even a week. So the organization and fury of the protesters wane. The authorities brutally suppress the uprising with bloodshed and killings, and the issue subsides until the next government blunder. And it turns out that Iran is just another example of a country trying to invent its own unique path and hitting a dead end. Moreover, each time it's different. For some reason, the Shah dragged the conservative peasant Islamic society into a Western way of life and ultimately lost touch with reality and failed to see that not everyone was pleased with it, and many were simply hungry. And remember, you can't teach democracy to a hungry person. The current leadership is clearly afraid to let go and give society more freedom, which no longer wants to live in isolation. By the way, this applies not only to Iran. The development of any country is partly similar to the development of a person, a child. At some point, it's important to nurture, educate, and guide them toward the right opportunities. Remember how the Shah reformed agriculture but simply forgot to provide opportunities for those who left it. And at some point, on the contrary, this excessive care and control lead to rejection. And people need to be given the freedom to make decisions for themselves. So I wish all of us to learn and to not be afraid to make decisions.